master notes again. How are you all? Hope all you are fine. Please like, share and subscribe this channel and push the bell icon so that you will get earliest notification about my videos. So hope you all enjoy my video. Watch the video till the end. Okay? So in my previous video, Unit 4 MSc 6 American Literature, the structure and style of Walt Whitman's text and Emily Dickinson's text already I have discussed. Today I am discussing Unit 5, that is critical perspective. So here it is the structure, objectives, introduction, 19th century modern and contemporary response to Walt Whitman, 19th century modern and contemporary response to Emily Dickinson, let us sum up, glossary, a select bibliography. So here the unit 5 is very much elaborate structure and style imagery of critical perspective of Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman's text. So it is a very small unit. So watch the video till the end so that you will enjoy the video. Okay. So here it is the objectives. So every unit has its own objective, already I have told. So here the objective is, our primary objective in this unit is to give you an idea of the shifting critical response to Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson from the 19th century to the contemporary time. Okay. So here is the shifting critical response to Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson from the 19th century to the contemporary time. Here is the introduction. We have already told you that Emerson had greeted the publication of Leaves of Grass in 1855. In spite of his reservation about the erotic in Walt Whitman, Emerson felt that the first great American poet had arrived on the somewhat dreary literary scene. So Leaves of Grass in 1855, in spite of his reservations about the erotic in Walt Whitman, Emerson felt that the first great American poet had arrived on somewhat dreary literary scene. But on the whole, the literary establishment was too conservative to respond adequately to Whitman's radical subversive poetry. Okay? So, but on the whole, the literary establishment was too conservative to respond adequately to Whitman's radical subversive poetry. It was, however, in the 20th century that critics like F.O. Matheson, R.W.B. Lewis, and Charles Friedelson could accept Walt Whitman's radicalism and also appreciate the American idiom in all its particularity. Okay? So Walt Whitman's radicalism, R.W.B. Lewis, Charles Friedelson, and also appreciate the American idiom in all its particularity. It was F.O. Matheson who pointed out the Leaves of Grass as primarily a language experiment. It has been the singular achievement of contemporary critics who could relate Walt Whitman's radical taste to the tumultuous time of civil war in America. It has been the singular achievement of contemporary critics who could relate Walt Whitman's radical taste to the tumultuous time of the civil war in the America. It has been the singular achievement of contemporary critics who could relate Walt Whitman's radical taste to the tumultuous time of civil war in America. Okay, it has been the singular achievement of contemporary critics. The foremost critics of the contemporary age like Betsky, Erkela in Whitman, the political poet 1989, David S. Reynolds in Walt Whitman's America, and Martin Clammer in Whitman's Slavery and the Emergence of Leaves of Grass have recreated for us the relevance of Whitman's poetry both of his time and also for our time. Okay. So, Walt Whitman's radical taste to the tumultuous time of civil war in America. The foremost critics of the contemporary age like Betsky, Erkela in Whitman, the political poet, David S. Reynolds in Walt Whitman's America, 1996, Martin Clammer in Whitman's Slavery and the Emergence of Leaves of Grass, 1995, have recreated for us the relevance of Whitman's poetry both for his time and also for our time. So here it is a main key point. You can note down any two of the name. Okay, the age like foremost critics of contemporary age like Betsky, Erkela in Whitman, the political poet, 1989, David S. Reynolds in Walt Whitman, America, 1996. Okay, So, as far as Emily Dickinson is concerned, only 7 of her poems were published during her lifetime. As far as Emily Dickinson is concerned, only 7 of her poems were published during her lifetime. Okay, as far as Emily Dickinson is concerned, only 7 of her poems were published during her lifetime. Even her literary mentor, like Thomas Wentworth Higginson, felt that her poems were too fragile and delicate to be published in the Atlantic. Okay, even her literary mentor, like Thomas Wentworth Higginson. So, who was the mentor of Emily Dickinson? You can get a question from NET exam also. The literary mentor of Emily Dickinson was Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Felt that her poems were too fragile and delicate to be published in the Atlantic. Emerson felt that the lady wrote as if she was suffering from some kind of fever. It was, however, the publication of the Harvard edition of Emily Dickinson poems in 1955 that brought her poems in limelight. Conrad Aiken described her as the most perfect flower of the New England transcendentalism. Okay, so who described Emily Dickinson as the most perfect flower of the New England transcendentalism? Here is the name is Conrad Aiken. Okay, so Conrad Aiken described her as the most perfect flower of the New England transcendentalism. Ellen Tete felt that Emily Dickinson poems are so different from conventional poems popular in her time. So Ellen Tete felt that Emily Dickinson poems are so different from conventional poems popular in her time. That is why he felt that her poems are not widely read. Ellen Tate felt that Emily Dickinson's poems are so different from conventional poems popular in her time. That is why he felt that her poems are not widely read. Okay, that is why he felt that her poems are not widely read. Ivor Winters was of the view that Ivor Winters was of the view that Emily Dickinson was a product of New England Puritanism and also its staunch critic. Ivor Winters was one of the view that Emily Dickinson was a product of New England Puritanism and also its staunch critic. Okay, so Ivor Winters was of the view that Emily Dickinson was a product of New England Puritanism and also its staunch critic. It is, however, the singular achievement of contemporary critics like Donna Dickinson in Emily Dickinson 1985 and Helen Macnell in Emily Dickinson 1986 to bring out the contemporary relevance of Emily Dickinson's unconventional dash-laden trenchant poems. There are mirror of a woman who realized intensely the miserable plight of a single woman who wanted to live a full and vigorous life of unhindered creativity. In other words, Emily Dickinson's poems are radical and subversive in their own way. One can safely say that both Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson are two of the most authentic voices of 19th century American poetry. Then here we go. 19th century modern and contemporary response to Walt Whitman. Okay, so what is 19th century modern and contemporary response to Walt Whitman? Alan Stewart has made a pointed reference to the detractors of Walt Whitman in American poetry, that is 20 Publishers Boston 1988. So Alan Stewart has made a pointed reference to the detractors of Walt Whitman in American poetry, that is 20 Publishers Boston 1988. In the 7th chapter of the book, there is an anonymous reviewer in the Cincinnati Daily Commercial of 1st January 1860. So there is an anonymous reviewer in the Cincinnati Daily Commercial of 1st January 1860. He was of the view he has undertaken to be an artist without learning the first principle of art and has presumed to put forth poems without possessing a spark of the poetic faculty. Okay, without learning the first principle of art and has presumed to put forth poems without possessing a spark of the poetic faculty. He was of the view he has undertaken to be an artist without learning the first principle of art and has presumed to put forth poems without possessing a spark of the poetic faculty. Even an accomplished critic like Matthew Arnold said in a letter to W.D.D. Conner, while you think it is, even an accomplished critic like Matthew Arnold said in a letter to W.D.D. Conner, while you think it is, Whitman's highest merit that he is so unlike anyone else. Whitman's highest merit that he is so unlike anyone else. To me, this seems to be his demerit. While we are today attracted by the originality of Walt Whitman's diction and syntax, a critic like Matthew Arnold stepped in the classical tradition found Walt Whitman's originality unacceptable. Another reviewer in the London Critic of 1st April 1856 was of the view Walt Whitman is an unacquainted with art as a hog is with mathematics. His poems, we must call them so for convenience, resemble nothing so much as the war cry of the Red Indians. There are also some reviewers who were not so hostile. A reviewer is the Brooklyn Daily Times of 29 September 1855 described Walt Whitman as a rude child of the people, no imitation, no foreigner, but a growth and idiom of America. The critics of the Transcendentalist school were far more perceptive in their response to Walt Whitman than the critics who belonged to the establishment. For example, Thoreau wrote in a letter to his friend Harrison Blake, though rude and sometimes ineffectual, it is a great primitive poem, an alarm or trumpet note ringing through the American camp. Wonderfully like the Orientals, too, considering that when I asked him if he had read them, he answered, "No, tell me about them." One can also refer to Emerson's letter to Walt Whitman. I find it most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed. So here it is the main key point you can note down. One can also refer to Emerson's letter to Walt Whitman. I find it the most extraordinary piece of the wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed. I find incomparable things said incomparable well as they must be. I greet you at the beginning of a great career, which you yet must have had a long foreground somewhere for such a start. There is no wonder that there is something of the transcendentalist faith in the divinity of man in Walt Whitman's poetry. So there is no wonder that there is something of the transcendentalist faith in the divinity of man in Walt Whitman's poetry. By and large, American critics have been preoccupied with the stress on the individual and individualism in Walt Whitman's poetry. By and large, American critics have been preoccupied with the stress on the individual and individualism in Walt Whitman's poetry. Okay, so by and large, American critics have been preoccupied with the stress on the individual and individualism in Walt Whitman's poetry. In the 20th century, Walt Whitman became the focus of a lively debate between the William Carlos Williams School of Critics and the T.S. Eliot School of Critics. So here it is a main key point. In 20th century, Walt Whitman became the focus of the lively debate between the William Carlos Williams School of Critics and T.S. Eliot School of Critics. While the former were rooted in specific nature of American local and reality, the latter went abroad physically and intellectually like Henry James, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot. Among the former mention can be made of Vernon Parrington, who lauded Walt Whitman as a heroic Democrat. Okay, so Henry James, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot. Among the former mention can be made of Vernon Parrington, who lauded Walt Whitman as a heroic Democrat and a great figure, the greatest assuredly in our literature. Among the former mention can be made of Vernon Parrington, who lauded Walt Whitman as a heroic Democrat and a great figure, the greatest assuredly in our literature. So Vernon Parrington, former mention can be made of Vernon Parrington, who lauded Walt Whitman as a heroic Democrat and a great figure, the greatest assuredly in our literature. Whitman, the political poet. A.4. Matheson laid stress on the linguistic resourcefulness. A.4. Matheson laid stress on the linguistic resourcefulness of Walt Whitman along with an appreciation of his radicalism as a Christian socialist. A.4. Matheson laid stress on the linguistic resourcefulness of Walt Whitman along with an appreciation of his radicalism as a Christian socialist. In Walt Whitman Reconsidered, Richard Chase considered Walt Whitman as a comic, albeit neurotic genius and a master of new critical wit and irony. R.W. Lewis, The American Adam, 1955, laid stress on the new Adam that figures so prominently in Walt Whitman's poetry. The expatriates like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, however, found Walt Whitman's poetry too political and radical for their literary taste. Ezra Pound, in particular, found Walt Whitman to be a pig-headed father. So here it is the main key point you can note down. Ezra Pound, in particular, found Walt Whitman to be a pig-headed father. Then, it has been the singular achievement of contemporary critics like Joseph J. Rubin in The Historic Whitman, 1973, Betske Erkeles Whitman, the political poet, and David S. Reynolds' Walt Whitman's America, a Cultural Biography, 1996, that Walt Whitman's radical poetry has been evaluated in the context of the Civil War and the cracks in the American Republic. It has also been pinpointed that Walt Whitman's explicitly political poems degenerate into journalistic propaganda, but his authentic radicalism is best expressed in his most personal poems like Song of Myself, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, and Passage to India. One can however still find the largely psychological and transcendental approach in Paul Zweig's Whitman, The Making of the Poet, 1984, David Cavitz's My Soul and I, The Inner Life of Walt Whitman, 1985. 19th century modern contemporary response to Emily Dickinson. Then, what is the 19th century modern and contemporary response to Emily Dickinson? We will study. 19th century response to Emily Dickinson's poems showed a kind of inability to comprehend the hardcore of her poetry. Her literary mentor Thomas Wentworth Higginson felt that her poems were too delicate and perhaps fragile and formless to be published in a popular journal like The Atlantic. A literary master like Emerson was of the view of Miss Dickinson sick writes verses as if threatened with fevers. The few pieces of hers that I have before me are heavy with religious sentiment. Emily Dickinson by Donna Dickinson, 1985, page 40. In other words, Emerson regarded Emily Dickinson as a New England Puritan steeped in the orthodoxy of sin and redemption. There is no wonder that Emily Dickinson remained practically unknown and unappreciated in the 19th century. It was in 1890 that Poems by Emily Dickinson was published by Robert Brothers of Boston. Okay, so it was in 1890 that Poems by Emily Dickinson was published by Robert Brothers of Boston. This slender volume was followed in 1891 by 166 poems under the title Poems Second Series. This slender volume was followed in 1891 by 166 poems under the title Poems Second Series. These poems were read by discerning readers. In 1896, Mrs. Todd edited Poems Third Series. It was, as we have told you earlier, the publication of the poems of Emily Dickinson edited by Thomas H. Johnson, the Belknap Press of Harvard University Press, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1955, that history was made and all the poems of Emily Dickinson were made available to the readers whose number kept on growing. Apart from the intensity of vision that is found in her poems, including a preoccupation with death and immorality, attention of the critics was also caught by her wit, precision of language, and Emerson-like use of epigrams and irony. So, here it is the main key point you can note down. Apart from the intensity of vision that is found in her poems, including a preoccupation with death and immorality, attention of the critics was also caught by her wit, precision of language, Emerson-like use of epigrams, and irony. In other words, Emily Dickinson was a far more complicated modern poet rather than a dogmatic Puritan. The description of Emily Dickinson as a New England non doesn't do justice to her complexity as a modern American poet. Among the modern critics, however, the stress continued to be on the religious and metaphysical dimension of Emily Dickinson's poetry. Among the modern critics, however, the stress continued to be on the religious and metaphysical dimension of Emily Dickinson's poetry. Conrad Aiken regarded her as a singular mixture of Puritan and freethinker. Okay, so who regarded Emily Dickinson as a metaphysical dimension or a singular mixture of Puritan and freethinker? Here the answer is Conrad Aiken. Okay, so Conrad Aiken regarded her as a singular mixture of Puritan and freethinker. The problems of good and evil, of life and death, immortality and transcendence, however, continued to preoccupy her mind. Ellen Tate pointed out that Emily Dickinson's poetry is bristling with ideas, and the ideas revolve around heaven and hell, sin and redemption. In other words, she is steeped in Puritan dogma of sin and redemption as a result of God's grace. Ellen Tate also felt that in the history of Puritanism, Emily Dickinson came between Hawthorne and Emerson. Ivor Winters was of the opinion that Emily Dickinson not only affirmed New England Puritanism but also questioned and discarded much of its theology. Some critics are, however, of the view that questions are far more important in Emily Dickinson's poetry than final answers. The quest is far more important than the destination. We have already told you that the contemporary critics like Donna Dickinson in Emily Dickinson, Helen Emsinel in Emily Dickinson 1986, and Jane Donoghue Everwin in Strategies of Limitations 1985 have attempted to look upon Emily Dickinson's poetry from a press perspective. They regard poems as the mirror of the single woman who wanted to live a life of free creativity and bold exploration of the female psyche. The pain that figures so prominently in Emily Dickinson's tough and provocative poems is not an abstraction. It is a concrete experience of a woman, a single woman, who is resolutely constricted by the conventions of New England's male-dominated patriarchy. One could end this brief note with a quotation from Helen Emsinel. I am acutely conscious that recent criticism, including mine, has only barely begun to understand the breadth of Dickinson's accomplishment. I am acutely conscious that recent criticism, including mine, has only barely begun to understand the breadth of Dickinson's accomplishment. Okay, then let us sum up. Walt Whitman was a poet who was partially understood by the critics of his own time. Emerson greeted him warmly, but he had strong reservations about his eroticism. Thoreau regarded him as something of beast. While the modern critics laid emphasis on Walt Whitman's free verse and transcendentalism, the contemporary critics regarded him largely as the healer of the wounds of the Civil War. They also pinpoint the presence of slang and the street culture in Walt Whitman's radical, subversive poetry. The modern critics of Emily Dickinson laid stress on her preoccupation with New England Puritanism, but the contemporary critics look upon her poetry from a feminist perspective. They remind us that Emily Dickinson was a single woman hemmed in by the conventions of patriarchy in New England. Far from submitting to patriarchy, she subverted it trenchantly. So here it is the glossary: eclair, make bright, illumine, rondeur, globe moving in space, Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, Jupiter, fifth largest planet from the sun, Trinitas, three parts of aspects. Okay, so here is the glossary of critical perspective and a selected bibliography. So here it is the selected bibliography. You can read this. Okay, this is all about critical perspective. So please viewers, like, share and subscribe my videos and push the bell icon. So thank you viewers.